Hi, welcome once again to Worldviews in Church History. I'm your host, Kent Powderly. Let's start with a word of prayer. Thank you, Lord, for this day. Father, thank you for allowing us to do this series. And Father, please help us to finish up these last 3 weeks or thereabouts. And we praise you and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. We are at week 26. Light at the end of the tunnel, folks. Lord willing, it's not a freight train. It's the second coming. But anyway, outreach and isolationism in Evangelicalism and Catholicism, the great 19th century revivals, and Vatican I, Shifting Foundations, Part 3. Now, we saw in the 19th century thus far how churches responded to a widening worldview fracture during some very troubled times. In America, the Civil War brought changes to the focus of evangelism and the way things were done. Some of the refocus was corrective, but some of it catered to an unrepentant form of war weariness. See what we mean by that in a minute. Britain and America became a powerhouse of support for missionary activity at home and abroad. In fact, it is this period that is really the height of the expanse of the Christian gospel, either in terms of the stage set for it to reach the height of its expansion, or to at least get everything into place so that it could continue to expand, the faith could continue to expand in many different localities, not just in the West. So the stage was set for that. This is sort of like the height. Forces in Christian education, however, continued to absorb the materialistic and the romanticist worldview shift that we've been discussing. Catholicism and High Church Anglicanism also suffered from the further collapse of the Christendom church-state model that they were part and parcel of. In other words, the way government was done, both secularly and in the church, was rapidly changing at this point. And it just was no longer the way it was, and it wasn't going back that way. In addition, American churches, particularly in the South, often reacted to their situation in worldly rather than biblical ways, unfortunately. Now, a spiritually vital church among the African American slaves had developed, which became the core of post-Civil War black communities during and after Reconstruction, which was that brief period where for a short time things seemed to be going in the right direction, but then the whites in the South, as they were able to get more control back of their local government in the post-Civil War, they overthrew the Reconstruction and began to establish what has come to be known as the Jim Crow era, where they, instead of having this huge monolithic black slavery, they're going to try to make it bad for blacks piecemeal throughout the South, which pretty much meant that they were able to do some really bad stuff, and they did. But there was a spiritually vital church among the African ex-slaves, and they were the core of both black communities and the attempt to construct desegregated communities, which did not go over good at first. Now, God has always favored the oppressed of his people. And not just because they are often the ones who are most fervent in prayer and worship, even though they are. American slavery based on race had produced a culture of horribly unjust segregation and double standards, especially in the church. And of course, that's where the ugliness of it is most visible, simply by the nature of the church being, the nature of what the church should be versus what the church was being. Now, by comparison, let's turn back the clocks a bit, take us all back to the 3rd century, and do the whole series all over again. No. If we go back to the 3rd century, you might remember back in week 3 or 4 it was, Callistus, Pope of Rome, had been the slave of a prominent Christian imperial advisor. And this advisor later submitted willingly to Callistus's pastoral authority. That was an attention getter. That is what we commonly refer to as being a witness. In the Roman Empire, churches contained slaves, freedmen, and masters, all equal in the same Christian community. In fact, that was what made Christianity stand out, was you had that sort of thing going on. This was never true in America's segregated society and churches. It wasn't true during the time of slavery. It certainly didn't become true after. In other words, the comparison between slavery in the Roman Empire and slavery in the United States is really kind of an apples and roundish rocks comparison, because they were really two very different animals, these two institutions. Now, this is a drawing of a outdoor Sunday morning. Black slaves would gather for church, and in the immediate post-war era, it really didn't change all that much, because they certainly didn't get church buildings instantly now that they were emancipated. And so you had these, they were like camp meetings. They were like the old Second Great Awakening camp meetings extended. And the black spirituals, the music that they did, I like what Francis Schaeffer said about it. He just says, I love those spirituals. There was a deep, deep vein of biblical Christianity there. And black churches, particularly among the Baptists and the African Methodist Episcopalians, were at the core of trying to construct biracial communities and a nexus for leadership in securing political rights for blacks. So the churches were the nexus. That was a central connecting point for all of these things. Not that the churches were like the boss or calling the shots or anything, but no, it was the cultural core. It was the only culture really that black community had at this point. And it was a great foundation. This is George Freeman Bragg. He's an African Methodist Episcopalian. Now, you remember in the Second Great Awakening, the Methodist Episcopalians were pretty much the main movers and the shakers in that awakening. And of course, a lot of people in Kentucky and along the Appalachians, good number of them were runaway slaves. And so they found a home in the Methodist Episcopalian churches. And pretty soon there was a separate African Methodist Episcopalian, because even among the abolitionists, there was a tendency to think, possibly to some degree unconsciously, in segregation-type terms. George Freeman Bragg argued for equality both in the church and beyond based on the teaching of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. Now, he's talking in terms of human origins. He's not saying that all men are Christian brothers. That's not what they're saying. But they're talking in terms of creation. Some people get uptight if you talk about the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God, as if we're making some sort of a doctrinal statement about, everybody's a child of God in the redeemed theological sense. No, this only refers to the fact that we are all created in God's image. It has to do with creation, not with the way we are at redemption. Another well-known figure, Hiram Revels, was a black preacher, had become a chaplain during the Civil War, became the first United States black senator from Mississippi. That he was able to win an election, well, even though blacks in that area outnumbered whites hugely, terrified a lot of the white ex-Confederate types. And the ugly reaction to the rise of black church-centered communities is typified by three separate white supremacist terrorist sects that each called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. One happened right at this point now in the 1870s, during the Reconstruction era. The second would come a generation later during the Jim Crow era, which we'll cover. And a third would pop up during the 1950s and 60s during the civil rights movements. But they were actually three different groups. But they might as well have all been the same because they all thought the same. One imitated the other. This is in fact, the original KKK, a lot of times they went around in black, oddly enough. These were drawings of captured costumes during the original Reconstruction era Ku Klux Klan. And this was a political cartoon over what was happening at the time. Black churches were getting firebombed. It was an awful situation. It was very violent. A lot of reactionary things going on, and it was driven by this Ku Klux Klan and other groups. I think what was the other one called? There was the White League. They were a little bit more out in the open, like trying to be openly political about it, whereas the Ku Klux Klan tended to be more. They were the secret terroristic, but they both worked together, and it was ugly either way you cut it. And there's another set of drawings of some of the costumes that the Klan, the original, the first of the three Ku Klux Klans would wear. And the sad truth is that prominent Southern white churches were as heavily engaged in the KKK in all of its versions, the Reconstruction era, the 1920s Jim Crow era, and the 1950s-60s Civil Rights era version of the KKK. They were just as invested in that as the black churches were in community building and the fight for civil rights. And this would affect white evangelicalism in America all over the place. Because first of all, you can't have half of the evangelical church affected and the other half not. You can have the back and forth, which there was, but it led to a real ugly situation, one that I think it can be fairly said that we underestimate even today. I think in some ways it can be fairly said. And despite all of this, though, God graciously brought a desperately needed revival to the post-Civil War American evangelicalism. Because it could be said that the abolitionism driven in the Second Great Awakening, which was an earlier form of American evangelicalism, had been a big part of the whole Civil War thing, the things that led up to the Civil War, along with a whole bunch of other things. Needless to say, after war, people are war weary. Now, the wave of this new revival was spearheaded by a converted shoe store clerk by the name of Dwight Lyman Moody. And probably most of you listening to this have heard of D.L. Moody. He's sort of the quintessential American evangelist. Moody's ministry was different from Charles Finney's in that it had a much firmer theological base. Even though Moody was likewise, like Finney, he was not formally schooled in theology. Now, Finney had been to law school and all that. Moody was largely self-taught. And his vision led to creating schools of discipleship for women, boys, and minority groups, including immigrants and former black slaves. And he supported a lot of cross-cultural mission work, notably that of James Hudson Taylor in China. He hooked up, he became connected with Hudson Taylor and actually several other international Christian movements in Scandinavia, even though he didn't actually go there, I don't think. Some of the Scandinavian Lutherans got a hold of some of Moody's stuff and were really impressed with him. And so he had a lot to do with that too. Moody, almost single-handedly, with his brother-in-law, Fleming H. Revell, Moody almost single-handedly created the American Christian publishing industry. Moody Bible Institute, even today, produces literature and videos to equip evangelism, apologetics, church building, and is very, very well known and well respected, and still does a very good work. They've kept up with the times fairly well. Sadly, American evangelicalism was conflicted not only by racism, though, but by calls for post-war reconciliation, a clash between real ethical demands. The whites in the North and the South, there had to be a massive amount of reconciliation for the country. So that there were, and sometimes these two equally important demands were at loggerheads with each other, at least in the short run. Reconciliation between the North and South, like I said, it wasn't just a regional issue. Families had been ripped apart from within. I mean, we had people who went to war with each other, with family that they had spent Christmas together with, you know? I mean, that literally happened quite commonly. And Moody felt pressure from both his duty to foster a desegregated church and culture and from his duty to foster reconciliation to a sharply divided white America. So these were two very real needs. And the clash between these, at the time it seemed mutually exclusive at times, but they were real demands, would explode when Moody went to preach in Georgia. He had planned one of his evangelistic crusades. I don't remember if he ever called them that, but we'll call it that because everybody else does. But he was incensed when he discovered from his front people, well, when he's on the way there, that the meetings that they're going to have in Georgia are all going to be segregated. That was not how Moody wanted to do it. But the front man knew the Southern attitude toward desegregated meetings, and he advised him to go along with it. Because by this time, there's a lot of violence going on. There's a lot of reactionary stuff going on. In many ways, it was a powder keg. And while taking the easy road has proved to be bad advice, Moody could not have our 20/20 hindsight. And given his initial reaction, he was outraged. He was incensed when he found out, what? We're going to do this segregated? We're going to do one meeting for the whites and another in another place for the blacks? That isn't what needed to happen. But by the same token, alienating the entire white South, which it seemed like they were in fear of doing, and there was some legitimate fear of that, would make everything worse for everyone. Maybe they were thinking that. And that, again, not having the 20/20 hindsight that we have, it at least could be reasonably thought. And Moody went along with his front people and immediately regretted it. As a reaction to Moody's decision by African American leaders who had been born into slavery were mixed. Frederick Douglass was appalled and angry. Booker T. Washington was more merciful. Now, Douglass was rightly grieved. He rightly grieved that, and he said, the Negro can go into the circus, the theater, and be admitted to the lectures of Mr. Ingersoll. Ingersoll was he was sort of a 19th century version of Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, wrote a book called The God Delusion. There were anti-Christian pundits in those days too, and Mr. Ingersoll was one of those. But he cannot go to an evangelical Christian meeting. Now, Booker T understood that Moody was caught in the ugly political realities of the era. And he stressed that the good that Moody tried to do for all races, and Moody was very much, he was reaching out to a lot, trying to reach out to everybody across the board here. But the world wasn't cooperating. Likewise, African Methodist Episcopalian pastor L.H. Smith wrote to Moody saying, "We, the Negroes of Savannah, thank you more than language can express for the services you gave us at our churches." And he also praised Moody's chaplaincy to black Civil War vets, too. So I don't think Douglass was just whining, okay? I think that would be a very unfair thing to think. I think he was rightly grieved. But I think all three of those responses from the black church were appropriate. I think all three of those things needed to be expressed. Now, Moody's compromise may have averted some short-term unrest, but it also fed into a long-term sense of unhealthy denial over racial tensions in white American evangelicalism to this day. I'm sorry, there is more than enough evidence to be able to say that. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who says that is saying that truly, but it is true that it's there. And I know I as a white American evangelical, I think I have to face that. I don't think that's unreasonable. It's history. We have to deal with it. And we're going to see that we can't just deal with it by saying, okay, we did it, get over it. No, that's not how, first of all, that's not a decent thing to say. Even if people are today trying to take advantage of a bad situation, you don't deal with that by trying to gloss over the situation. That's not good. And aggravating the problem was the popular rise of social Darwinism in universities everywhere, Europe, America. And this was something that was eagerly embraced by angry, disaffected, and defeated Southern whites at the time, even sometimes in the churches. Social Darwinism is the application of Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest to social issues like nationality and race. Moody vocally opposed Darwinian evolution at a time when thoughtful opposition to Darwin was still very new and undeveloped. Just to give you an idea. Darwin's book hadn't even been out 10 years yet. In other words, a thoughtful understanding of Darwin wasn't even possible completely, percolated down to the popular level at this point, let alone a thoughtful opposition response. This suddenly there's this pseudo-scientific rationale popping up to reinforce the racism that too many churches had for too long compromised with. Now this, you can see over here, this is a real textbook. A real textbook drawn by a guy named Ernst Haeckel. He was sort of one of Darwin's groupies. Anyway, Haeckel was drawing the evolutionary tree of the great apes. And he includes black people. Not with humanity, but with the apes. At this time in evolution, they hadn't even really figured out whether all current human beings were supposed to be evolved from one stock, or whether you had several different human races developing in parallel to each other in different places. In fact, at first, that was a very popular assumption. As time went on, the data showed that clearly wasn't the case. In fact, the data shows really that evolution doesn't happen the way any of them conceived. But at the same time, this was a big deal. And social Darwinism, it immediately gets translated into the realm of politics. Protestants of many stripes had decontextualized, jumbled, and misapplied isolated parts of the Mosaic Law to justify slavery based on race and racism in general for quite some time. For instance, Noah's curse on Canaan in Genesis 9:18 through 27 was overgeneralized to include Canaan's father, Ham, and maliciously misapplied just to form one of these kinds of justifications. Now, black Africans in the Genesis record, the Genesis Table of Nations, are descended broadly from Cush, who was Ham's oldest son, not from Canaan, who was Ham's youngest son. The curse of Ham doctrine was accepted in some churches even as late as when I was a young Christian. I became a Christian. I was in the Navy at the time. I was stationed in Millington, Tennessee. I was in the South. And some of the churches, the people that I had, bumped into during my first couple of years as a Christian, I heard about the curse of Ham doctrine. I didn't buy it, but I heard about it. And this was at the end of the 1970s. So this was something that was it was well rooted in there. And like I said, this is an actual page from a period science textbook. Now, Moody does not deserve to be pilloried in the dismal light of this failure. And there are people trying to do that to him today, and he doesn't deserve it. He later repented of this. He never really thought that the meetings should be segregated, ever. He went along with it reluctantly, and he later repented of that. His ministry philosophy actually pioneered what is today called the non-denominational or anti-sectarian approach to ministry. And sectarianism had gotten especially bad in America during the decades leading up to the Civil War and afterward, partly due to divisions over slavery. And this is how we originally got Southern Baptists, by the way, unfortunately. Not that Southern Baptists are still in that place. They're not. They've made some very real and very sincere progress. But during this era, you had church splits. I mean, it's a fact of history. And some of those splits survived the Civil War era, and eventually the world moved on. And everybody was left with their denomination. And actually, the Southern Baptists did pretty well. It took a while, but they did pretty well in addressing the issue and repenting of it. Was it perfect? I dare say it was not. But I think we have to allow people to repent and move on. We have to be able to move on. If we can't move on, we can't heal. And America could sometimes be a free-for-all where religious doctrine was concerned. But freedom to argue the ideas is necessary to refine and apply those ideas. It's unavoidable. It shouldn't be avoided. It should be done carefully and respectfully and in a biblical spirit of brotherly love. Now, Moody was a layman who avoided political, social, and even formal doctrinal debates. He knew where his gift was. He was an evangelist. He wouldn't be writing any systematic theologies. Other people were better equipped for that in his mind, and rightly so. Moody understood his limits and stuck to sharing God's offer of salvation through Christ. That was his ministry. That's what he stuck to. Now, some unfairly accuse him of doctrinal compromise because he didn't get involved in these disputes, okay? Sorry, people, you can't have everything. But Moody never denied the importance of teaching ministry, just limited himself to where God gifted him. And he showed a humility that Mr. Finney had sorely lacked. Now, Moody came to Christ in the fading days of the Second Great Awakening. It was in the 1850s. And though he was a moderate Arminian, Moody embraced the dispensational theology of Irish Calvinist John Nelson Darby. Now, dispensationalism is the idea that God has dealt with humanity in somewhat different ways throughout history, in stages, or what are called dispensations. God has always saved people by grace alone, through their faith. He accepts people's belief in his character and word in the same way he did that of Abraham, who believed God and it was accounted to him as righteousness. Abraham believed that what God had told him was true, and God accepted that trust as if it were the righteousness that neither Abraham nor any fallen human being could ever achieve by their own effort. Romans 4. The content of what God told Abraham in the promise concerning Isaac was different. It was less, for one thing, it was less developed, fewer details, focused more on certain things that it was less developed, fewer details than the content of the gospel that we trust in today. In other words, Abraham didn't have a clear idea that there would be a Messiah as such that was coming. He just knew that it would be through his seed that the human race, all nations would be blessed. He knew that there was a blessing, but he didn't know the structure or the manner in which that blessing would come to us. So you could say that the content of what Abraham believed was somewhat different. It wasn't in contradiction to, but it wasn't as developed as. Remember, we deal with a progressive revelation in Scripture. God is adding new information as time goes on during the period in which Scripture is developing. In other words, Noah and Abraham did not have a clear idea of a Messiah as such, but they believed what God said the same way we believe what God says when we believe the gospel. And consequently, God was free to emphasize the different aspects of what he was doing in any given time and place in history during the eras in which Scripture was being developed. And so that he could reveal and develop his plan in a progressive way. Each dispensation was characterized by somewhat different but not contradictory messages, depending on what God was doing at the time. In the era of Moses, God was building a new ethnic group and a single nation. This was a different work than what went on in Jesus' day when God was making an appeal to people in all nations. Thus, Israel and the church are, and indeed logically have to be, distinct. Now, since God's work and revelation are progressive, and Israel and the church were works from different stages of the progression with somewhat different purposes, then the idea that the church could replace Israel as God's elect exclusively is more than just a mere oversimplification. It's flat out false. There can only be one Israel and only one church, but the term elect can be applied to either group, depending on the sense and purpose of the particular form of election that is being discussed. Now, whatever problems one might find in its late appearance as a theological model, and there are some problems, nevertheless, dispensationalism offered a more precise window into Bible prophecy that dealt with real distinctions found in the text itself. And it was a step ahead in this regard over earlier attempts to theologically harmonize Bible prophecies and related things. Now, there is a difference between God electing a single ethnic group in an early part of his program and him electing individuals out of many ethnic groups to form a gathering from out of many nations at a later stage in his program. Both groups are distinct from each other, but elected for God's purposes, and thus they have a relationship to each other. Darby, unfortunately, thought very little of Moody. When Moody came to Ireland and preached, Darby was really just real disappointed. He looked down on the guy. Moody had accepted Darby's views on prophecy, but not his views on the church or on election. In other words, Darby was in a snit because Moody didn't decide to become a Calvinist. Poor baby. Sorry. Now, Darby and his followers had a bad reputation for being contentious and kind of nitpicky, and Moody found this very disappointing. Nevertheless, the logic of Darby's dispensationalism was more attractive than the contentiousness of Darby and his crew was unattractive. It was unattractive, but let's face it, sometimes a good idea is a good idea. Doesn't matter who has it. And it was one of those deals. Now, Moody's encounter with the premier British evangelist teacher, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, went far better than the one with Darby had in Ireland. In fact, Spurgeon invited Moody to come and preach at his, it was originally the Park Street Chapel. It became called the Metropolitan, oh, doggone it, I can't remember the name of it, but I will. He also preached at the London Opera House, the Great Opera House in Haymarket. And these are newspaper drawings of that event right there. Now, when Moody went to London, he was invited to preach at the Metropolitan Tabernacle. That's what I was trying to say there. At the Metropolitan Tabernacle, which was Spurgeon's pastorship. So those other pictures were from the London Opera House at the Haymarket Square there, and Spurgeon then invited Moody to teach at the Metropolitan Tabernacle. Spurgeon had been pastoring there for some time by that time. Now, several notable British Calvinists were appalled when one of their number, Spurgeon, invited Moody to speak. And their reasons for objecting were similar to those that Darby had used in Ireland. Darby had a deterministic view of election, as did some of Spurgeon's fellow Calvinists, and possibly Spurgeon himself. Spurgeon often wrestled with the issue of election versus free will. And he was often known to say, look, I don't understand it. I can see the Bible clearly teaching both. And so I'm going to teach both. Almost Calvary Chapel approach to the problem 100 years ahead of time, isn't it? I think that's one thing that Calvary Chapel has really gotten right, was the way it approaches the whole issue of Calvinism versus Arminianism. Of course, we've already been over it, but we have some tools today that they didn't have 130, 140 years ago. Yet Spurgeon defended Moody against similar detractors in England. He kept his disagreement with Moody in perspective, in other words. Spurgeon saw that the Bible taught both real choice and predestination, equal force. You can't get away from it either way. Now, Spurgeon, like Moody, did not have a great deal of formal theological education, but was so well read that he gave himself the equivalent of one. In fact, if you were to look at Spurgeon, Moody, and Finney, in terms of real education, Spurgeon had the other two outclassed. Even though in terms of formal degrees and stuff, really not. They were all pretty much the same. But Spurgeon, God had really used his preaching and had given him a huge platform. He was a strong opponent of slavery. He began preaching. He had a full pastorship by the time he was 19 years old. He was sort of like the Greg Laurie of his era. And so he had a full pastorship at age 19. And this was during the early 1850s. And so slavery in America was still happening. It was still a big topic, even in Britain. He taught and wrote in the language of the common man. He put the cookies on the lower shelf. But he didn't do it at the expense of the intellectual depth. That was what was so beautiful about this guy. He used the language of the common man, put the cookies on the lower shelf. He was the most widely published and popularly read preacher in the world. He would preach his sermons, and there would be stenographers taking it down, so that by Sunday evening, the presses were already going. By Monday evening or Tuesday morning or something or thereabouts, his Sunday sermon would be, you could get a copy of Spurgeon's sermon to read. And he was very, very popular because he wasn't like the other preachers. He was he just spoke from the heart, and he spoke more like a commentator sometimes than a preacher. Now, another thing about Spurgeon is he was not an Anglican. He was a nonconformist Baptist, opposed to Christendom-style state churches. So he was an outsider. And yet, his very quickly became the largest congregation in London. The Anglican Church was in rough shape spiritually. The most popular preachers were not Anglicans. The most effective preachers, biblically speaking, were not Anglicans, most of them. And this was certainly true of Spurgeon. Spurgeon was what we might call another nexus, connector point, an anchor point for overlapping events and people at a key time and place in history. People he had no control over. He didn't plan this. He didn't set it up. It was just things kind of, events and people kind of came together in a certain way at a specific time in certain places, and it just happened. God did it. So he's an anchor point, a nexus at this time in history. He connects D.L. Moody to James Hudson Taylor, who is ministering in China. He connects with David Livingstone, who is ministering in Africa. So there's a global thing happening. This is really the first time a real global thing is happening. And by the way, in case you sometimes get a weird feeling as you're hearing about some of this stuff and reading it, if most of us had lived in we today lived in the 1880s and the 1890s, we would have been the liberals, not the conservatives. Liberal and conservative are not a constant in history. We really need to divest ourselves of the idea that they are. Spurgeon was interesting in another way. He suffered crippling bouts of depression. I don't mean he just got bummed out sometimes. No, these were crippling. He wrote, "I am the subject of depression so fearful that I hope none of you ever have to get to such extremes of wretchedness as I go to. But I always get back again by this. I know that I trust Christ. I have no reliance but in him, and if he falls, I shall fall with him. But if he does not, I will not." And I'm sure he added, "I know he won't." That's something I can profoundly relate to with some of my health problems. Spurgeon's passion was deeper than it was loud. Though he knew how to raise his voice when he had to, he spoke and wrote with the voice of the common man, not because he was anti-intellectual, he wasn't, but because the intellectual language of his day was loaded with pretension, as is often true. Today, actually, we have the opposite problem, believe it or not. It is anti-intellectualism that is in the driver's seat in the universities. And that's a very ironic thing there, isn't it? An anti-intellectual ideology is in charge of education. Gee, where do you suppose that's going to lead, huh? I can tell you where it has led, to greater pretension. Spurgeon showed great depth of both mind and soul, and that's what we need. That's the sort of thing we need right now. And Spurgeon was a nexus for 19th century global missions as well. This is David Livingstone. He brought the gospel to Central and South Africa, the northern parts of South Africa. A.N. Groves was working in India. James Hudson Taylor, China. And already a generation or so ago, we had William Carey and Adoniram Judson. We'd mentioned them last week. Now, David Livingstone was the great Scottish missionary who changed the course of Africa's history. And I wish we had more time to go into him. But definitely do a little bit of research on the guy. He's definitely worth finding out about. There's a drawing of him in Central Africa, bringing the gospel. He was also at one point attacked by a lion, literally. And there's a very famous drawing of the event. And these are Livingstone's missionary journeys. The top one, the green one, I think was one that he did with somebody else. But the other ones, the red, the blue, and I think it's orange or yellow, I can't really tell, are the different missionary journeys, sort of like Paul's missionary journey in the Bible. Well, this is David Livingstone's missionary journeys in Africa, right here. He discovered Lake Ngami and several other Central African lakes. He opened up until that time, Africa had been called the Dark Continent. James Hudson Taylor worked in China. I can also relate to this guy, at least this meme anyway. Normally I'm not a big meme guy, but some of these have come in pretty handy. When I cannot read, when I cannot think, when I cannot even pray, I can trust. And I won't go into the details, but I've gone through a week where I couldn't read, I couldn't think, and I couldn't even pray. And praise God, I trust. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here giving you this teaching right now. And this is Hudson Taylor in his China garb. Kind of interesting looking dude. And he founded the Inland China Mission, and this is a photo of him and his Inland China Mission staff there. Now, if this were a normal church history series, we would be going into a lot of detail about guys like Livingstone and Hudson Taylor. Certainly a lot more about Spurgeon and Moody. Love to do that, but you know what? There's a wealth of documentation of these guys and their ministries. It's important. It's the height. It's like the height of the wave of evangelicalism. And both Roman Catholicism and Evangelicalism in the 19th century responded at times poorly and well. When Christians responded well, it came in some form of spiritual and or material outreach. And I recommend y'all, those have an interest, there's wealth of good information, even on the internet, about these people that you can do your research from. Because you'll find that whatever you find is going to fit in that pattern. When the Christians responded well, it was some form of material and or spiritual outreach. Could be material outreach, could be spiritual outreach. When we responded poorly, it came by some form of spiritual isolationism. Protestant came to the height in the great revivals and the missionary expansion of Bible-centered churches worldwide that occurred in the latter half of the 19th century. Some in the earlier parts, but most of it began to take on steam during the latter half. Protestant forms of isolationism tended to take the form of a retreat from the intellectual and cultural scenes, usually in a mistaken application of trying not to be worldly. We should try not to be worldly, okay? Unfortunately, there are ways that we can apply that truth that we can misapply it. A truth can be misapplied as easily as it can be applied. I think if we've learned anything in church history at all, it has to be that. Now, Catholicism did its form of isolation by way of trying to restore fortresses, as historian Bruce Shelley put it, by formally establishing a sense of its temporal authority at a time when the world had already moved on. If you notice a lot in church history, it seems like there's a lot of feverish battle. And then the world moves on. And you have the Christians, and by the way, it isn't just Christians, everybody does this, okay? They're still fighting their old battles. They're still fighting the battle that their grandfather already won, or their grandmother, or both. So Catholicism did its isolation thing by trying to reestablish its sense of temporal authority. Now, just to give you an idea of what was going on in Italy at this time, you had the Italian Revolution. King Victor Emmanuel and a revolutionary by the name of Giuseppe Garibaldi had overthrown the Papal States and united Italy into a nation. And the Pope was dethroned in Rome. Now, Catholicism did better in how it expanded its sense of social outreach during this period, particularly in medicine and in the labor movements of the late 19th to early 20th century. But not without some rough spots. This is John Henry Cardinal Newman. The Christendom churches, Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism, suffered decline as governments were secularizing during the 19th century. Most governments went completely secular, but even those that did not, like, well, for example, there was still the Church of England, the governments were secularized during this time. And a small movement of Anglican prelates at Oxford saw the decline of the state church as the destruction of the church itself. Bishop John Henry Newman saw the shrinking of the importance of liturgy. Well, that would be a natural side effect of widespread literacy. Back in the day, when Christendom had developed and most people were illiterate, a liturgy was a very powerful and important teaching tool. I remember as a young boy, I was a Roman Catholic growing up, a little Irish Catholic boy from Boston. And one of the things they would teach us were the Stations of the Cross. There were 12 Stations of the Cross. And every Catholic church has them. 6 down one side of the church, 6 down the other. There are these plaques that show the story of the crucifixion, you know. And you go from one station to the next, to the next, to the next. And there are various, each station has its own little story. Well, that's liturgy. That was an important teaching tool during the times when before there was a lot of education. But now Christendom is in the decline here. And a lot of capital had been placed in the whole importance of liturgy thing. And of course, then you had the Council of Trent, which basically declared that the Mass, the Catholic Mass, was the same as the sacrifice of Christ. Now you're dealing with the 19th century. Almost everybody's literate now. Liturgy isn't going to be that important. People can read the Bible for themselves. It's available. It's there. But people for centuries have been doing it one way, and guys like... Now, Cardinal Newman, he became a cardinal once he finally went back to Roman Catholicism because he saw, the state church is falling in England. It doesn't look to be doing real good in Germany. The Lutheran state church at that time, the Kaiser Wilhelm I and II were ruling Germany. The church wasn't doing real good there. So he retreated back to Rome. And they, of course, quickly elevated him to the rank of cardinal. They liked the way he thought. But I don't want you to get the wrong idea about Cardinal Newman. He was not a crazy monarchist kind of a mentality. He was a good man who was doing what he thought was right. Yeah, he was wrong. He was putting way too much emphasis on something. He was treating something that at one time had been expedient as if it was of primary importance. And he wasn't seeing what was going on, the wonder of what was going on right in front of his eyes in England at this time. But he had a real heart for the poor. He had a heart for the Lord as best he understood him. And he, I think, got it totally wrong as to what to do about things. And so his little clique at Oxford there, and that's a little political cartoon of him. The one in the middle is Cardinal Newman there, you can see. Anyway, I want to be fair to the guy. Now, Vatican I really was the Catholic form of spiritual isolationism, quintessential right there. The Pope is the monarch of Christianity, even if only in spirit. That's the spirit of Vatican I. The Pope has just been ousted from being the monarch over the city of Rome. The last remnant of the Papal States have fallen. King Victor Emmanuel has been crowned King of Italy. And Pope Pius IX complained that he was a prisoner of the Vatican. And in some ways he was. He could come and go, though. He just didn't have the temporal authority anymore. The main agenda of Vatican I was the doctrine of papal infallibility. We're going to ram that one down there because the Pope's losing his authority, so we got to make sure he has a basis for authority. Yes, he's infallible. This is Pope Pius IX. One's a painting of him, and the other's a photograph of him done around the middle of the 19th century or thereabouts. Now, the idea of papal infallibility had been debated for about 8 centuries or thereabouts. And it was a doctrine built for the times of Pope Gregory VII. And indeed, it was the logical outgrowth of that period. By the 19th century, however, it represented the mindset of political theologians who had basically painted themselves into a corner. In fact, you can think of the whole idea of papal infallibility as theologically painting oneself in the corner. Now, the papal infallibility is often misunderstood by people who are not Roman Catholic. It does not claim that the Pope is sinless, or even that he is always right about everything, not even necessarily always right about everything he says about church things necessarily. It is a very narrow claim that the Pope is infallible when he speaks from the chair, Latin ex cathedra. We get the word cathedral from the chair. That's where the chair of a bishop's seat is. Okay? So when the Pope is speaking from the chair as the bishop, think of the chair as like a throne. Well, hasn't Episcopalianism, bishop rule, Pope rule, that has all been very closely connected to monarchy throughout the history we've been talking about. So only when he's speaking from the chair authoritatively on matters of faith and doctrine. That's where infallibility supposedly works. Now, it has been used only 2 ways, and I think only 3 times, since it became the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church in 1870. Either to add authority to beliefs already understood universally to be core Christian thought anyway. For example, Pope John Paul II's anti-abortion encyclicals. He said, no, this is from the chair. So he appealed to papal infallibility. But what he said about abortion and everything was stuff that Christians had believed all along. Okay, yeah, we buy that, John. That's fine, you know. So that would be one way in which infallibility was used. Or the other way, and this is the more problematic way, to give authority to teachings that have no biblical support or historical support whatsoever. And this was done in the 1950s with the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary, and the idea that Mary is, I think, the co-redemptrix with Christ. These ideas, at least the Assumption of Mary, if I remember correctly, was the Pope at that time appealed to papal infallibility. And that's how the idea that Mary was taken up into heaven, you know, and a lot of the accreted distortions about Mary were now cemented into place in a very similar way that the idea of papal infallibility itself was cemented into the place after the world had moved on. There was a member at Vatican I, a bishop by the name of J.H. Ignaz von Dollinger, and he wrote a book called The Pope and the Council. And he was a Catholic, and he wrote this to try and warn up front that they were going to try to ramrod infallibility. He was a Catholic who was against papal infallibility, and he wrote, "None of the ancient confessions of faith, no catechism, none of the patristic, that would be the Church Fathers' writings, composed for the instruction of the people contain a syllable about the Pope, still less any hint that all certainty of faith and doctrine depends on him. For the first 1,000 years of church history, not a question of doctrine was finally decided by the Pope. Even the controversy about Christ that was kindled by Paul of Samosata, which occupied the whole Eastern Church for a long time and necessitated the assembling of several councils. He was a monarchian, like those Sabellians that we talked about. Well, even that was terminated without the Pope taking any part in it. In 3 controversies during this early period of the Roman Church took an active part. The question about the dating of Easter, and we talked about that. Heretical baptism, we didn't really talk about that. And about the penitential discipline. In all 3, the popes were unable to carry out their own will and view and practice, and the other churches maintained their different usage. Pope Victor's attempt to compel the churches of Asia Minor to adopt the Roman usage of when to date Easter, we went over that, by excluding them from communion proved a failure. Clearly the Pope was not infallible, and it all didn't hang with him. Now, Catholics did a lot better in the social outreach department. There, they didn't do the spiritual isolation thing. They did the material outreach thing, and that they did right. That part they did right. Henry Cardinal Manning, who's the Cardinal Archbishop of London, used his goodwill to promote a modern Roman Catholic view of social justice. In fact, he laid the foundation for what modern Roman Catholicism believes about social justice. And a lot of that isn't bad stuff. Later on, you had the liberation theology. That stuff came in, and we'll cover that a little bit when we get to the mid-20th century. So these views are reflected in the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum, issued by Pope Leo XIII, which marks the beginning of modern Roman Catholic social justice teaching. But it wasn't just Cardinal Manning. No. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, likewise, worked with Cardinal Manning for fair labor practices in the United Kingdom. So even Spurgeon jumped on board with Cardinal Manning on this issue. And in the United States, there was a Catholic labor activist by the name of Terence V. Powderly. Yes, he is my great-great-grandfather. You look a little bit alike, which is surprising. This picture is the only picture I've ever seen of him where any part of him looks like me. Anyway, he opened the Knights of Labor, which was this little sort of Knights of Columbus-y kind of group at first. But what it was is it became the first effective labor union in the 1880s. Powderly led it, and Powderly was not a Marxist. At first, the Catholics had the corner, Catholic moral philosophers had the corner on fair labor. The Marxists only later did what Marxists do and try to sack the people who aren't Marxists. Well, anyway, Powderly was one of he started the first effective labor union in America. And he opened the door to Protestants, which ticked off Pope Leo XIII, no end, and to blacks, which ticked off a whole lot of both labor and management. So this guy did not make himself friends by doing this. He made a lot of enemies. But it was the right thing to do. That's one thing I can say about it. Him and I would probably disagree on most things, but in this thing, Bruce Shelley mentions him in Church History in Plain Language. Anyway, he's a perfect example of the whole, one thing that Catholics, not so much Catholicism, but Catholics in places like America that had thrown off the whole church-state thing, where the Pope was politically irrelevant, although Catholics still, were loyal to him and stuff, and, at heart, at least, based on what I can read of the guy anyway. That's Pope Leo XIII. Almost excommunicated Powderly until this guy down here, James Cardinal Gibbons, went to bat for Grandpa Terence there. And so he didn't get excommunicated, had the bull written and everything. And Gibbons went to bat for him and said, you got to understand, Holy Father, you got to understand, they do things differently over here in America. That kind of thing doesn't work. Trust me on this one, you won't regret it. Well, the Pope decided to trust him. And, well, the rest is, as they say, history. Anyway, next week, the Welsh Revival, Pentecostalism, Fundamentalism, and Religious Existentialism, Christianity in the 20th Century, Part 1. God bless you all. Have a great week.